Well, good morning to you all from London. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today, and I'm only so sorry I can't be with you there in Auckland to celebrate this conference together with you. It's a great pleasure to have the chance to speak to you, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional welcome that was provided at the beginning of the day. Now, there are two key questions I'm going to try to address with you today. One is, what will be the long-term impacts of COVID-19? And the second one is really about what this means for infrastructure, and particularly for the role of infrastructure in how it supports communities, how it supports economies, but also how it supports transitions. Now, in order to address this properly, it's important to go back to where we were just before the crisis began. One way of looking at this is to say that New Zealand was already one of the most highly urbanized countries in the world. Its bigger cities, particularly Auckland, Wellington, and indeed Christchurch, were growing. And increasingly, they were becoming recognized, as you can see on the right-hand side, in the global roster of increasingly important cities. Globalization was causing our cities to grow and causing them not just to have opportunities to increase jobs and productivity, but also exposing particular kinds of challenges in housing markets, in infrastructure platforms, and in the ability to service a growing population. Now, in that context, cities like Auckland and Wellington were beginning to be recognized as global leaders. They were standing out already for their quality of life, for their specialization in new technology-led businesses. They were recognized for the efforts they were making on sustainability. And they were having great momentum when it comes to thinking about a knowledge economy. Although much of their progress on knowledge economy was also fueled by international demand through international students and through international and cross-border cooperations. So when we think about COVID-19, we need to think of it in the context of the previous cycle of growth and the kinds of opportunities and challenges it was presenting. I think it makes sense to think about COVID-19 as not just a health crisis, which it clearly is, and the Prime Minister and the Mayor have already referred to that, not just an economic shock, which leads to a recession, which of course will have sorting effects, prioritizing some industries and downgrading others, prioritizing some nations and downgrading others, and of course prioritizing some cities and downgrading others. But we must think about COVID-19 not just as a health crisis and as a recession, but of course also as an agent of change. Now, when you think of it as an agent of change, it's essential, I think, to do two things simultaneously. The first one is to recognize that it has very distinctive phases to it. The first phase of pandemic management, which many countries are now coming through, and where New Zealand has excelled, is marked slightly unevenly by the introduction of a vaccine or by the achievement of net zero, as it were, cases. But it's also marked rather more by a set of other changes that are occurring, which we see much more in the recovery. And when we think about when pandemic management moves to recovery and then to reset, we need to have our eyes not just on the health crisis itself, but on other geopolitical shifts, technological developments, and wider things that have happened in the global economic system. So what would be wrong is to think that the pandemic is over when we have no more cases, but also it would be wrong to think about that we can extrapolate, as it were, from the pandemic management period, a whole series of things that might go on in the future. Anyone like me who digests the global media at the moment will be very aware that there are many predictions of the death of cities or the end of CBDs. Many of those predictions come from the United States. At the same time, if you look at what's happening in China and other parts of Asia Pacific, especially some of the larger cities in Northeast Asia, you will see that they're far from the death of cities. We're already experiencing a new kind of resurgence. So it's important, I think, not to extrapolate from one phase lessons that you think will be long-term. Now, when we think about the long-term effects of COVID-19 as an agent of change, perhaps we can say that 6 particular imperatives have been revealed as being critical in terms of their capacity to change the kinds of economies and communities that we have. Very quickly, the first one of these is to do with trade and supply chains, where what COVID-19 has done is to prove that all sorts of supply chains and trade platforms that have been focused on efficiency may not have been sufficiently resilient to deal with the kind of crisis that we've faced. And as a consequence, many nations, many companies, many industries and sectors are reworking their trade and supply plans in order to create more optionality, in order to create greater resilience, and to focus much more on using data and digital capability to manage trade and supply better. There are big opportunities in all of this for the reworking of city and regional economies. The second big area of change that COVID-19 has highlighted is, of course, the massive uptick in technology, in digitization, and in the as-a-service business models that have come from it. As we've already heard very well, I think, from Andrew and others, what technology has done is to change our relationship both to services, to places, to spaces, and to products, creating, as it were, a completely new kind of logistics industry, but at the same time having the power to reorganize both demand and supply in things like medicine, in education, in culture, in entertainment, and in retail. So whilst we may be happy about the opportunity to have a more customer-centric focus, we must wonder about the impact of digitization, for example, on international tourism or international higher education. A third big area of change from COVID-19, of course, is about the revealed challenges in health and well-being and the inequalities and inadequacies of the systems that have been revealed. Now, New Zealand, of course, has been a world champion in this space, but many other countries have discovered, much to their surprise, that certain populations have been much more disadvantaged than others by COVID-19, and it has revealed, as it were, an inadequacy in the health services, particularly in things like testing and tracing and other kinds of laboratory-based activities that have led to a call for a new settlement in healthcare and in health infrastructure into the future. The big uptick in digitization, of course, is creating a completely new market in digitized medicine and in remote medicine and everything that happens in relation to how doctors provide their services. A fourth big area, of course, is to do with planet and climate change. The link between human health and planetary health has been solidly made during this period of the pandemic. On the one hand, the origins of the pandemic are to do with the disruption of the food chain with the animal kingdom. On the other hand, of course, people with pre-existing respiratory conditions have been more prone to the virus and are often, they have those conditions because of their exposure to poor air quality. And of course, the experience of lockdown has been, to one extent, a kind of accidental experiment in decoupling productivity from carbon emissions in such a way that we can say it's possible to have much more productive economies, but not to produce so much carbon at the same time. If you like, we've proved to ourselves that this is possible. The fifth big area of change is to do with politics. It's the relationship between citizens and governments, where trust, where security, where new kinds of regulations and laws have been introduced. New Zealand has, as you know, enjoyed a very high level of trust and cooperation between citizens and governments, but this has not been universally true around the world. And for many, this is the incursion of the state into the life of the citizen. And at the same time, we have seen national governments move away somewhat from multilateral arrangements. The big trade deal agreed last week for Asia Pacific, of course, is good news in this regard. But that trade deal stands out as being one of the very few multilateral agreements to have survived this pandemic, and we see somewhat a retreat into competitive nationalism. Now, the sixth big area of change we might call a new social contract. There are many dimensions to this. On the one hand, as the health scare has revealed so much inequality and so much inadequacy, there's a move towards much greater addressing of inequality moving forward. On the other hand, the big uptick in technology and digitized platforms gives rise to all sorts of questions about taxation, what is fair taxation and how that works. And of course, the rise in the climate agenda gives rise to, indeed, a new kind of license to operate for businesses within our economy. This new social contract also brings with it some questions about public finances, how we tax, where we generate revenue, what we borrow for, where we invest, how we pay for infrastructure becomes a critical issue in this new social contract that will emerge post-COVID. So these six ideas taken together seem to me to represent some of the longer term implications of COVID that we need to think about as we move forward. And in their own way, they produce a set of new questions about population and jobs. Where will the population settle? How will we create the new jobs? They raise some important questions about settlement patterns, cities and regions and places, which I'll come on to speak about. But they also raise very large issues about utilities and infrastructure and real estate and how agile they're able to be in reconfiguring themselves towards the new world that we will face. You see, from the point of view of the rest of the world looking at New Zealand, it's very important that New Zealand has been so successful in creating this demonstration of how to manage a pandemic of this kind. But the key question must be, what does this do to the demand side profile of New Zealand's trading partners? And how successful will they be in producing the customers that New Zealand needs into the future? Now, to pick up on those issues, I want to really tackle three issues very quickly. One is to do with climate, a second one is to do with technology, and the third one is to do with economies. We know very well that in the Paris Agreement, it was recognized that a 0.5 rise in sea levels would be catastrophic for the world. And that's why it was agreed that 2 degrees maximum of global warming would be the target. You can see here on my chart the vast range of the world's cities that are threatened by a rise in sea levels above 0.5 meters by 2050. And you can see, of course, where you are in this picture. Because of this extreme now anxiety about sea level rises and its link to climate change, we see many cities embracing a net zero carbon agenda. And New Zealand cities, of course, are leaders in this. And to embrace net zero carbon, there's a fundamental challenge to revise and to reform the business models for infrastructure. These, of course, are to do with energy, the shift from the sources of energy. They're to do particularly with transportation, the electrification and integration of infrastructure. They're to do very, very deeply with real estate and construction, turning buildings into net energy producers, thinking about low carbon materials, and of course, eliminating waste, optimizing the way that logistics perform, and thinking much more deeply about water consumption and indeed water recycling and reuse. So the net zero carbon city agenda is an infrastructure agenda that brings with it not just a requirement for new incentives, new ways of investing, new forms of regulation. It also brings a requirement to rework business models so that they're able to deliver the outcome and at the same time be sustainable in their own way. Now, this links very carefully to the whole idea that we need to focus on net zero, not just as an agenda to address climate change, but also as an economic strategy, as a livability strategy. net zero as a social and innovation strategy, a way, if you like, of reaping the multiple benefits and thinking about how to capture value from the net zero pathway and to use that to finance infrastructure in reworked business models as we move forward. This brings us very clearly to the second topic of technology, the recognition that we are in the fourth industrial revolution, the digital age, but that age has just been vastly accelerated in all new kinds of ways because of COVID-19. What this leads to is a recognition that, if you like, infrastructure has become a digitized service. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can see all the different ways in which the new technologies that are being accelerated by the pandemic are changing the way that our infrastructure systems work and requiring them not just to be more efficient, but to be much more agile and to embrace forms of hybridity they didn't have before. At the same time, in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see how digitization is reworking our economies to produce a new set of job creation opportunities. One way of thinking about those is to start to recognize that the new jobs in our economy will come from the interface between previously separated sectors that are beginning to become much more integrated because of the functions that technology places. This is not least true in the area of the systems and services economy, sometimes called urban services, and in the circular economy. But it's also true in the experience economy. We see new technologies rapidly eroding the barriers between these separate sectors and creating opportunities for much more interdependence, much more new job creation, and new models of enterprise emerging through these new supercluster processes. Now, when we think about this economy more generally, we can see that there's been a global consensus about sectors that have been negatively impacted on the left versus those that have been positively impacted on the right. We can see the degree of certainty at the top and the degree of uncertainty at the bottom. So we can see that certain traditional sectors like aviation and travel, or restaurants and hospitality, a high level of confidence that they will decline, but also a desire to see them find their right size and their new structure, their new symmetry. Now, in order to do that, of course, we need to recognize that market sentiment has followed these predictions, and we can see which sectors in the economy are predicted to decline, which ones are predicted to grow, but also the enormous response that came in the last 10 days as news of the progress in vaccines reached all of us in one way or another. As you can see in my very simple slide here, on the left-hand side, 3 different kinds of medical intervention. On the right-hand side, sectors of the economy that will be enabled if we're able to have these interventions. A widely available vaccine, comprehensively applied in multiple parts of the world, is absolutely critical to picking up our urban services, our real estate, our hotels, our travel, and indeed our international higher education, our conventions, our conferences, and so many things that are a critical part of the New Zealand economy. These things will only come back to some kind of new normal when we have a complete response to the pandemic, but they will have within them the carried behaviors of the first period of the pandemic, the increased digitization and the reworked business models. So we expect to see a hybrid system emerging from all of this. This is perhaps best summarized by having a quick look at the real estate sector. Here you have on the left-hand side a set of sectors and subsectors and indeed locations where there's an expectation of growth. You have in the middle a set of sectors where there's a widespread expectation of some decline, although not full and not permanent decline. And then you have a great degree of uncertainty in these yellow sectors, and you can see what the challenges are that they will face as we move forward. Now, thinking about this in a longer term way, we can begin to talk about where New Zealand might be headed next. On this chart, you can see various different diagrams that represent different kinds of settlement patterns where infrastructure is an enabler of where people live and the choices that they make. At the beginning of the 1980s, when this century of the city began, New Zealand cities found themselves in boxes 1 and 2, essentially growing and densifying. But what COVID-19 will be is an accelerator of moves towards boxes 6 and 7 and 8 and possibly 9, as we will see overlapping housing markets and labour markets, with many of New Zealand's cities having new opportunities within them for people to live in distinctive locations and work in others. One way of describing this is to talk about the arrival of the blended city, a city where we combine the best of the physical amenities and attributes of the cities we know and love, coupled with the virtual city with all the benefits of digitization. But what this leads to is not just a new set of choices for citizens, but a series of leadership and investment challenges where infrastructure, I believe, will be most critically exposed. Taking this to the nth degree, we could say that we could ask the question, how will COVID-19 change house prices in New Zealand? Will it be the case, for example, that the places that have been highly inflated will simply spread out into broader regional geographies and people will live in all parts of both islands whilst having jobs in another part of the country? Or will we see New Zealand increasingly integrate with the housing markets of Australia or with ASEAN, so that people who only have to travel 1 or 2 or 3 times a month may decide to live in New Zealand and work elsewhere? And what does that mean for our taxation system and how we capture value? All of these questions, I think, arise from a long-term perspective on COVID-19. So to conclude, we've identified that there's a set of key first-order issues associated with the virus that will have a long-term effect on the way our economies and our societies emerge. These create both opportunities and threats, as the Prime Minister said earlier, but they also have within them very significant implications for infrastructure and how it relates to resilience, how infrastructure is an enabler of the path to net zero, how infrastructure can now serve a revised set of settlement patterns, how infrastructure couples with digitization to create a new as-a-service set of infrastructures, and of course these long-term financial models that are going to be required in an environment where value is created differently, where value is captured differently, and where value has become much more mobile. Thank you very much for listening to me. It's been a great pleasure to speak to you this morning. I wish you every success with the rest of your conference.